It started with the sound of tires crunching on my driveway at 2 in the morning, the kind of sound that jolts you awake because you know it doesn't belong there. I peeked out my window and saw the faint blue glow from my EV charger flickering in the dark, and there she was, Karen, standing in her robe, hair wrapped up like some deranged queen of the cul-de-sac, plugging her brand-new luxury EV into my outlet like she was filling a cup of sugar. I remember laughing out loud, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so sharp it could cut glass. Who walks into someone else's yard at night and decides their property is a communal refueling station? Only Karen. The way she strutted, as if she was doing the neighborhood a favor, made me realize this was not some drunken mistake. This was the start of something ridiculous. The next morning, she didn't even bother with subtlety. She marched right up to me while I was sipping my coffee on the porch, her car still tethered to my charger like in Ford drip. "Good morning," she chirped, though her tone was anything but friendly. "You should know the HOA has decided your charger is considered community property. Everyone can use it. That's how we keep the neighborhood fair." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. The truth is, I'd already been here long enough to understand Karen's playbook. She didn't ask for things, she declared them. She didn't borrow, she claimed. And the HOA board, most of them spineless or too busy to push back, usually went along with her. I leaned back, took another sip, and said, "That's funny. The electric bill still has my name on it. Unless you're offering to cover the costs, I don't see how you get to decide." Her eyes narrowed like I'd just insulted her entire bloodline. "You're being very selfish," she snapped. "You think you're better than everyone because you got the first EV charger. But this neighborhood is built on sharing." I nearly spit my coffee laughing. "Sharing means asking, Karen. Not stealing at midnight." She stormed off, muttering something about reporting me at the next HOA meeting. That's when I knew this was only the beginning. Later that day, I got the official email, Community Update, Electric Vehicle Charger Policy. Apparently, the board had voted that my private charger was to be considered a shared neighborhood asset. The email even had Karen's fingerprints all over it, flowery language about sustainability, fairness, and inclusivity. It was a masterpiece of entitled nonsense. They didn't mention who would pay the increased electric bill, or how they planned to rotate access. Just a blanket statement that my investment was no longer mine. I could have raged, but I didn't. I've learned that outrage is what Karen feeds on. What she couldn't handle was someone smiling while quietly sharpening knives behind the curtain. I installed that charger myself 2 years ago when I bought the car. Ran the wiring, hired the electrician, paid the fees. It wasn't cheap and it wasn't easy. The thought of every Tom, Dick, and Karen plugging in at will while I footed the bill was laughable. But instead of wasting my breath on emails or HOA meetings where she'd dominate with her theatrics, I started planning. I wasn't going to stop her from hanging herself with her own rope, I'd just make sure the rope was sturdy enough. The first test came 2 nights later. I left my charger live, knowing Karen wouldn't be able to resist. Sure enough, at 1 a.m., I caught her again, but this time I had my phone camera rolling. She noticed the glow of the porch light as I stepped outside, and her expression was priceless, somewhere between a deer in headlights and a toddler caught with her hand in the cookie jar. "I told you," she hissed. "This is community property now. Don't harass me." I smiled and waved my phone. "Just making sure I get the memo right. You know, for the record." She unplugged her car so fast you'd think the charger was radioactive, then sped off without another word. The following morning, my inbox was flooded with angry HOA emails, all clearly written by her but signed the board. They accused me of harassment, withholding community resources, and my personal favorite, disrespecting neighborhood unity. What they didn't know was that Karen's late-night field trips were already stitched into a neat little highlight reel. I didn't release it yet. Timing is everything. My neighbors started whispering. A few stopped me on walks, cautiously asking if it was true they could all charge at my station. Some were embarrassed. One guy even admitted Karen had bragged about liberating the charger for the neighborhood. That word, liberating, made me grin. She really thought she was some kind of revolutionary, storming the Bastille of my driveway. But while she was busy crowning herself the queen of shared electrons, I was busy engineering her downfall. Step 1 was simple. I installed a smart meter on the charger line. Every kilowatt that passed through it was logged, time-stamped, and stored. Step 2, I added a small Wi-Fi camera angled discreetly toward the charger. Nothing flashy, just enough to show who plugged in and when. Step 3, I quietly upgraded the charger with a lockout function. From my phone, I could enable or disable charging instantly. It looked normal on the outside, but I held the switch. The trap was forming, but I wasn't ready to spring it yet. Not until Karen was all the way out on her limb. And she climbed fast. Within a week, she was bragging at the pool about how she was saving the neighborhood money by centralizing EV charging. She painted herself as a visionary, the one who had tamed the selfish Tesla guy, me, into providing for the community. That's when I started getting actual requests from people I barely knew. Neighbors knocking on my door, texting me through the HOA group chat, asking if their cousin could top off their battery for free. I played dumb, pretending I didn't know where the rumor came from. Inside, I was delighted. The bigger the lie grew, the harder it would collapse. The real breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I walked outside to find not just Karen's car, but 2 others lined up in front of my driveway like I was running a gas station. Extension cords trailed across my lawn, and Karen stood there directing traffic like some demented attendant. When I confronted her, she puffed herself up and declared, "The community has spoken. This is bigger than you. You can't stop progress." That was when I realized she wasn't just taking my charger, she was using it to build her little empire of influence. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Got it? If this is really community property, I'll make sure everyone sees how generous you've been with my bills." Her smug smile faltered for a second. That was the moment she realized I wasn't backing down, even if she didn't yet know how much ammunition I had stockpiled. That night, as I scrolled through the footage of her little charging station stunt, I began stitching it together. Every late-night theft, every smug declaration, every neighbor's car sucking power off my dime. And just for flavor, I added the screenshots of my soaring electricity bills. The story was writing itself, and Karen had volunteered to be the star. I treated the HOA meeting like a stage and myself like a quiet conductor. When the board called a listening session, Karen showed up in full regalia, sincere smile, handouts, and a tone meant to convert. She spoke of fairness and sustainability, phrases that in her mouth meant, "Take your inconvenience and gift it to me." She painted my charger as a symbol of hoarding and delivered the lines people wanted to hear. People clapped. Rituals still work in suburbia. I sat with my phone recording, not for evidence alone but to fix the memory of the moment. Witnesses forget, video doesn't. After the meeting, the board proposed a committee to study community charging. Committees in HOA world are delay machines, and Karen loved delay because it let her coach allies and build visible momentum. I treated the committee like a trap of its own design. I uploaded permits, invoices, and inspection reports to the portal and quietly installed a smart meter and a small camera aimed at the charger. The meter logged kilowatt hours to the minute. The camera logged faces and license plates. Karen escalated theatrically. She organized a sustainability fair in my driveway, complete with folding tables and blenders powered from my outlet while she posed for photos. It looked like a charity picnic staged as a hostile takeover. People nodded and tweeted. The HOA newsletter printed a flattering caption. I could have called her out then, but I wanted her to inflate. Vanity, when inflated, leads to mistake. Small sabotage followed, an ugly smear of paint on my mailbox, a forum post questioning permit compliance. The committee requested usage logs. I supplied them with a calm smile. Numbers are merciless. The logs showed late-night charges, cars that didn't belong to nearby households, and clear timestamps that matched the camera footage. The data formed a pattern: unauthorized siphoning and a civic myth built on borrowed convenience. The committee convened a review. Volunteers with good intentions and sharper opinions went through the document. Some neighbors were surprised. Others defended the idea of free access on principle, abstractly. Mediations were suggested. Mediation in small towns is performative conciliation. Karen arrived with a folder of testimonials and a practiced look of injury. She had tears timed for maximum sympathy. The mediator proposed scheduled community slots and a promise to study funding for public chargers. I signed a temporary agreement with the expression of a man conceding to civility while plotting the endgame. I organized a transparency event at the community center and framed it as an educational session about responsible ownership. I displayed invoice printouts, a clear chart of kilowatt hours, and a looped video of midnight plugins. The crowd that had once cheered at platitudes now saw names, timestamps, and the human cost: rising electric bills and convenience taken without permission. Conversations shifted from abstract ideals to the concrete ledger. Supporters of Karen softened when confronted with receipt. That was when I nudged the narrative outward. Vanity loves an audience, and a wider audience makes accountability inevitable. I reached out to a local blogger with a concise, human angle: entitlement meets neighborhood infrastructure. The blogger came, asked questions, and framed the story not as a petty feud but as a cautionary tale about communal boundaries in the age of new technology. The piece hit the neighborhood feed like a cold splash of water. Karen reacted by doubling down publicly while scrambling privately. She filed a formal complaint accusing me of restricting access and weaponizing surveillance. Her language leaned on moral urgency, but moral language is only persuasive when it aligns with facts. Under the pressure of public scrutiny, her confident performance lost some of its veneer. Neighbors who had nodded at poolside smiles now asked practical questions about costs and responsibility. I let her keep performing for a while. Let her tell donors there were pledges and more chargers on the horizon. I let her speak at the garden club and gain small accolades. The trick was to let her overcommit publicly, so that any retreat would cost reputation. Then I tightened the screws. I publicized precise reimbursement figures and offered to refund documented overages if the HOA formalized policy. It was a simple offer, framed to make responsibility inescapable. The public shift from vague moralizing to irrefutable accounting changed the terms of the fight. Karen's rhetoric about community virtue started to sound defensive. She accused me of making drama. I accused her of mistaking civic theater for policy. The committee recommended reimbursement and a public clarification of HOA policy. It was not a knockout blow, but it was accountability in a place where rhetoric had previously ruled. I wasn't content with mere numbers. I wanted a spectacle that would make the entire neighborhood feel the embarrassment of misplaced virtue. So I amplified the human angle. I interviewed neighbors who had quietly suffered higher bills and asked them to tell their stories on record. I prepared a simple packet: invoices, names, timestamps, and short statements. I coordinated with a couple of EV owners to show how unreliable communal charging would be without proper policy. Meanwhile, I kept feeding Karen curated praise from random online forums to ensure she continued to believe the narrative of rising influence. The more she preened, the higher she climbed, and the worse her fall would be. One evening, as the sun slanted low over the cul-de-sac, a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door and handed me a stack of old receipts. He said he had been embarrassed to speak up earlier, fearing retaliation, but now he saw the math and wanted justice. I folded the receipts into the packet and felt the pleasant, odd certainty of a plan taking shape. It is one thing to be right. It is another to be undeniable. We set a date for a community meeting with the express intent of presenting the packet publicly and asking for an official accounting. When the meeting came, Karen arrived confident and camera-ready. She planned to announce a roadmap for more chargers and a campaign to raise funds. Instead, she found a stack of printed packets on the front table. The room shifted. People who had nodded from the sidelines now leaned forward. The first neighbor read his statement, voice steady. Another held up her monthly bill, and the room heard the numbers. Karen's smile tightened. I sat back and watched as the crowd, hungry for the truth they hadn't expected, began to change the subject of its admiration. Her empire of performative virtue had been reduced, in a few well-presented pages, to a ledger and a set of contradictions. It was the precise kind of deflation that leaves a loud person suddenly small, and I felt the thrill of that shift ripple through the room. This was not the final act. It was a carefully staged rounding of the corner. She would retaliate. Of course she would. But retaliation would be predictable now, and predictability is evidence. With the community watching, the next misstep would not be a private victory. It would be the seed of a public unmaking. The trap had moved from evidence to pressure, and the next chapter would be where the pressure turned into collapse. Karen's retaliation came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of the community meeting, where my packet of receipts had spread like wildfire, I received an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a letter stamped with the HOA seal, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and malicious obstruction of community progress. The language was thick with legal jargon, clearly something Karen had lifted from a template online. It demanded I cease surveillance of shared resources, pay restitution to the HOA for disrupting neighborhood harmony, and issue a written apology within 7 days. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The arrogance was stunning, but what struck me more was how predictable it had become. She wasn't winning, she was flailing, and flailing people grab sharp objects without realizing they're about to cut themselves. I didn't respond to the letter. Silence can be louder than words, and in Karen's world, silence is unbearable. 3 days later, I woke up to find a sticker slapped on my EV charger, bright red, with the words "Property of HOA" scrawled across it. It was laughably unprofessional, crookedly applied, peeling at the edges, but the message was clear. Karen was escalating to physical claims now. To anyone else, it might have seemed like vandalism. To me, it was exactly what I wanted, a visual display of her overreach. I snapped a photo, time-stamped, and tucked it into my growing archive. By the end of the week, she had called a special meeting of the HOA board, conveniently hosted at her house. I decided to attend, not because I expected fairness, but because it's always best to let your opponent expose themselves on their home turf. Her living room was staged like a courtroom, chairs neatly lined, cookies and coffee on a table, and her laptop projecting a slideshow titled Community Energy Vision 2025. She wore a blazer, of all things, and launched into her performance with the confidence of a politician on the campaign trail. Slide after slide painted me as the villain. My selfishness was juxtaposed with stock photos of happy neighborhoods and eco-friendly slogans. She even had the audacity to claim I had profited from restricting access, though she couldn't explain how. The board members, tired but wary, nodded along as if they wanted the ordeal over with. I raised my hand when she finished, keeping my voice steady. I appreciate the production, Karen. But I'd like to point out that everything you've just claimed lacks evidence. I, on the other hand, have it in spades. I didn't pull out the folder yet. Timing, again, was everything. Instead, I simply mentioned that my attorney had reviewed the HOA's governing documents and that nowhere did they grant authority over privately owned charging stations. The silence that followed was golden. For the first time that night, Karen faltered. The real fireworks came 2 days later. Someone, guess who, filed a complaint with the city claiming my charger installation was unsafe and unpermitted. Code enforcement showed up at my house with clipboards and hard hats, ready to sniff out violations. What Karen hadn't accounted for was my meticulous record-keeping. I pulled out the signed permits, the inspector's approval sheet, and even the contractor's warranty. The officers inspected the Charger, found it flawless, and left with an apology. When I closed the door behind them, I could almost hear Karen grinding her teeth from across the street. But her failure with the city only made her bolder. One morning, I woke up to find a handwritten sign planted in my yard. Neighborhood Charger, welcome. It was staked into the grass like it belonged there, and by afternoon, 2 cars I didn't recognize were lined up to use it. I activated the lockout feature from my phone, and the drivers quickly discovered the ports were dead. I walked outside, gave them a friendly wave, and explained that Karen had misled them. Their frustration turned on her almost immediately. By the time they drove off, one of them muttered that they'd be filing their own complaint with the board. This was when I realized Karen wasn't just overreaching, she was losing control of her narrative. Neighbors were starting to doubt her. The whispers at the pool and on morning walks weren't about my supposed selfishness anymore, they were about her antic. People had seen the sign, the sticker, the parade of strangers in my driveway, and they were connecting the dots. She was making herself look ridiculous, and all I had to do was keep providing gentle nudges and quiet documentation. The HOA board, sensing the growing tension, tried to intervene with a compromise. A proposal to fund a second, actual community charger at the clubhouse, financed by a modest increase in dues. It was a reasonable solution, one I would have supported from the beginning. But Karen opposed it with surprising fury. She called it redundant, a waste of resources, and proof of division. The truth was simpler. If the neighborhood had its own charger, she'd lose her leverage over mine. She needed my property to remain the battlefield, because it was the only stage big enough for her performance. That's when I set the next part of my trap. I quietly agreed to host a community demonstration of my charger for anyone interested, a hands-on session where I'd explain how it worked, how much energy it consumed, and why unrestricted use was unsustainable. I announced it through the HOA mailing list, framing it as educational. Karen couldn't resist attending. She thought it was her chance to grandstand. What she didn't know was that I had prepared everything to expose her at the perfect moment. The day of the demonstration, a dozen neighbors gathered in my driveway. I had charts, printouts, and a simple slideshow on my tablet. Karen arrived late, sweeping in with her trademark smirk, and immediately began interrupting. "This is all unnecessary," she declared. "The charger works fine as a shared resource. He just doesn't want to let go of control." That's when I revealed the smart meter data. I pulled up a graph showing exactly how much power had been consumed at specific hours, and then I played clips from the camera. Karen herself, plugging in at 1 a.m., directing other cars, even peeling the sticker onto the charger. The crowd gasped. Karen's face went pale, then red. She sputtered about privacy, about illegal surveillance, about doctored footage. But the timestamps matched the meter logs, and the image of her scrawling "property of HOA" in the dead of night was undeniable. Neighbors started whispering, some outright laughing. The woman who once commanded deference with sheer volume now looked like a cornered animal, scrambling for excuses that no one believed. She stormed off midway through the presentation, her car squealing as she sped away. But the damage was done. The neighborhood had seen her for what she was. Not a visionary, not a crusader for fairness, but a petty thief of electrons and a self-appointed monarch of nonsense. People lingered after the demonstration, thanking me for the transparency and shaking their heads at her behavior. One even suggested nominating me for the board. I declined politely, but the seed was planted. And I was just getting started. The morning after Karen's spectacular retreat from my driveway demonstration, the cul-de-sac felt different. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered small nods or amused smiles when I passed by. Even the couple who never came out except to collect their mail paused long enough to mutter, "Good show." But I knew better than to mistake temporary amusement for resolution. Karen was many things: loud, arrogant, entitled, but above all she was relentless. When humiliated, she didn't back down, she doubled down. I expected the counterattack, and part of me looked forward to it. It came, predictably, in the form of a lawsuit threat. A letter arrived from a law office I didn't recognize, full of bluster about invasion of privacy, emotional distress, and intentional infliction of reputational harm. It claimed damages in the tens of thousands and demanded immediate payment or a public apology. The paper was heavy, the font intimidating, but the signature was suspiciously generic. A quick search revealed the firm was one of those online template mills that sold boilerplate letters for $50 a pop. I chuckled and slid it into my growing collection of Karen memorabilia. If she wanted to turn this into a legal theater, I'd make sure the audience had popcorn. The board called another emergency meeting to address the escalating conflict. By now, the novelty of Karen's crusade had worn thin for many residents. Attendance was higher than usual, but the atmosphere was less supportive and more curious, as if people had come to watch a car crash they couldn't look away from. Karen took the floor immediately, arms crossed, voice trembling with indignation. She waved the bogus legal letter like it was a sword, declaring I had violated her rights, endangered the community, and should be stripped of privileges as a resident. Her eyes darted around, searching for nods of approval. Few came. When it was my turn, I stood calmly and said only this: I welcome any investigation. I have permits, documentation, and recordings that will hold up in any venue. I don't need applause. I just need the truth. Then I sat down. The silence that followed was more cutting than any argument. Karen ranted for another 10 minutes, but the more she spoke, the more she sounded like static, noise filling a room where no one was listening. But silence didn't satisfy me. I wanted her own momentum to carry her past the point of no return. So I planted a seed. During casual conversations with a few neighbors afterward, I suggested the idea of independent oversight. Wouldn't it be great, I mused, if the board hired a professional auditor to review our finances and practices? Just to make sure everything's transparent. I said it lightly, as if it were an afterthought, but the look on Karen's face when word reached her was priceless. She'd built her influence not only through noise but through the murky waters of HOA finances, where fees and dues often disappeared into projects of questionable necessity. The thought of an outsider poking through the books must have terrified her. That week, she tried a new tactic, painting herself as a victim. On the neighborhood Facebook group, she wrote long posts about toxic neighbors and men who bully women with technology. She posted blurry photos of my charger and claimed she felt unsafe in her own community. At first, a handful of sympathizers rallied to her defense, typing heart emojis and stay strong comments. But then others chimed in, asking why her car was on video in my driveway at 2 a.m., or why she had slapped stickers on property she didn't own. The thread spiraled out of her control, and by the time she deleted it, screenshots were circulating in private chats. I didn't stop there. I began leaking carefully chosen snippets of my footage, not to the public but to individuals who had sway in the neighborhood. The retired police chief, the pastor, the couple who ran the local daycare. People respected them, and when they quietly began questioning Karen's narrative, the ripple effect was immediate. Suddenly, the tide of opinion shifted from neutral observer to skeptical critic. Every stunt she pulled only confirmed the impression that she was unhinged. Then came her boldest move yet. On a Friday evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard voices outside and stepped onto my porch. There, in my yard, stood Karen with a clipboard and 3 teenagers in matching t-shirts emblazoned with the slogan, "Power to the People." She had recruited them to gather signatures for a petition to seize my charger as official HOA property. She looked triumphant, pointing at me like a prosecutor. "You can't fight the will of the people forever," she crowed. I didn't argue. I simply asked the teenagers if they knew whose yard they were standing in, whose power they were siphoning. Their hesitation was obvious. You don't need to answer, I said gently. But remember, signing a petition doesn't make theft legal. It just makes you complicit. They shuffled away, uncomfortable, leaving Karen fuming. Her clipboard held fewer signatures than she'd hoped. That night, I made my move. I uploaded a condensed video montage to a private neighborhood forum, a greatest hits reel of Karen's antics. Midnight plugins, sticker vandalism, driveway traffic jams, and her absurd sustainability fare. I captioned it simply, "Decide for yourself." The response was overwhelming. People laughed, people groaned, people shook their heads. The narrative was no longer mine versus hers. It was hers versus reality. Still, she wasn't finished. A few days later, I noticed something odd. My charger, normally pristine, had been tampered with. The cover was scratched, the screws slightly loosened. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to suggest sabotage. I checked the camera and, of course, there she was, crouching at dawn with a screwdriver. This was no longer about entitlement. This was desperation. I debated calling the police, but decided against it, for now. Sometimes letting someone dig their own hole is better than filling it in yourself. The board, under pressure from all sides, scheduled a formal hearing to resolve the dispute. It was the kind of bureaucratic theater I usually despised, but this time I welcomed it. Karen wanted a stage? Fine. I'd give her one, with brighter lights than she'd ever imagined. I spent hours compiling evidence into a polished presentation. Graphs, bills, photos, and video clip. I rehearsed my delivery until every word was sharp as glass. The night of the hearing, the clubhouse was packed. Neighbors filled the chairs, stood along the walls, even spilled into the hallway. Karen arrived late, strutting in like a celebrity, clutching a stack of papers and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She launched into her speech immediately, accusing me of greed, hostility, even sexism. Her voice rose, her gestures grew wilder, and by the time she was finished, she was practically shouting. Then it was my turn. I spoke calmly, methodically. I showed the permits. I showed the meter logs. I played the clips, her peeling the sticker, her crouching with a screwdriver, her hosting a faux fair in my driveway. Gasps rippled through the room. By the time I finished, the board looked pale. One member muttered that the matter should be referred to legal counsel. Another suggested Karen step down from her sustainability committee. For the first time, she was cornered not just by me, but by the very people she thought she controlled. Karen's silence lasted only 3 days, and in that brief window the neighborhood enjoyed a peace it hadn't known in months. No emails flooding the HOA listserv, no passive-aggressive flyers taped to mailboxes, no late-night prowling near my driveway. It was almost enough to make me believe she had finally learned her lesson. But people like Karen don't surrender, they regroup. And when they reappear, it's always louder, brighter, and far more unhinged than before. On the 4th morning, I woke to the unmistakable whir of a generator. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and there it was, Karen's latest act of theater. She had parked her car in the middle of the cul-de-sac, run an extension cord across the pavement, and hooked it to a portable generator that sputtered and smoked like an asthmatic dragon. Around the car, she'd set up lawn chairs and banners declaring community power, join the movement. It looked less like a grassroots initiative and more like a low-budget carnival. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. Some laughed, others frowned at the fumes, and a few actually clapped as Karen posed beside her car like a revolutionary leader. She shouted through a megaphone about my selfish monopoly and how she had taken matters into her own hands to liberate energy for all. The irony was rich. She was burning gasoline in a generator to charge an electric car. When I pointed this out, her response was drowned out by the sputtering engine and the coughing of the teenager she'd roped into handing out flyers. But the spectacle wasn't about practicality. It was about distraction. Karen knew she'd lost credibility after the hearing, so she was staging a new battlefront. The flyers accused me of colluding with energy companies, hoarding resources, and criminalizing compassion. The language was so over the top it read like satire, but the danger was in the noise. When someone shouts long enough, even nonsense can start to sound like truth to tired ears. I let her play her game for 2 days. I filmed the generator belching smoke, neighbors complaining about the racket, and the fire department eventually arriving to warn her about flammable liquids on public property. Each clip went into my growing archive. But I wasn't content with passive documentation anymore. If she wanted spectacle, I'd give her one. That night, I installed a small addition to my charger system, a programmable relay linked to my phone. With it, I could cut power at will or redirect usage to a secondary outlet fitted with a digital meter. In plain terms, I could allow anyone to plug in, but I'd be able to show exactly who consumed what and when. It wasn't just control, it was accountability weaponized. The next afternoon, Karen predictably stormed back into my driveway, camera crew in tow. Not a professional crew, of course, just 2 neighborhood kids with smartphones bribed with pizza. She announced she was staging a peaceful demonstration of how the charger should be shared. She plugged in her car, grandstanding as if planting a flag on conquered territory. I stood back, feigning indifference, and from my phone activated the relay. For 30 seconds, the charger hummed, lights flashing as if power flowed freely. Then, just as the cameras zoomed in on her smug grin, the system cut out. Her car chirped an error message. The kids snickered. Karen jiggled the cable, slapped the charger, and declared it must be sabotage. I shrugged. Looks like the system recognizes unauthorized use. She turned beet red, shouting about discrimination and illegal modifications. I calmly pointed to the secondary outlet with the digital meter. If you'd like to charge, Karen, you're welcome to. But the meter will log every watt-hour, and the bill will be yours. The silence that followed was exquisite. She glanced at the meter, at the watching neighbors, and at the teenagers barely holding back laughter. Then she ripped the plug out, tossed it aside, and stormed off without another word. The footage of her tantrum circulated privately that evening, and for once, I didn't need to release it myself. The neighborhood had become my distribution network. But Karen wasn't finished. The very next morning, a bright yellow notice appeared on my door. Cease and desist, unauthorized commercial use. According to the letter, I was illegally operating a charging business without permits. It was signed not by the city but by the Neighborhood Energy Task Force, which, after 5 minutes of research, I discovered was Karen herself. She'd printed the letter on her home computer, complete with a clip-art lightning bolt. Instead of tearing it down, I left it taped to my door for everyone to see. The absurdity spoke louder than any rebuttal I could give. By evening, half the block had strolled past to chuckle at it, and someone even added a sticky note reading, "Nice clip art." The next day, the letter disappeared. Karen's pride couldn't withstand mockery. The board, under increasing pressure to contain the chaos, finally announced a formal vote on whether to fund an official community charger at the clubhouse. It was the solution everyone except Karen had wanted from the start. She fought it tooth and nail, insisting it was redundant, expensive, and unnecessary. But this time, her opposition fell flat. The vote passed by a landslide. Construction was scheduled within the month. That should have ended things. With a community charger on the horizon, there was no reason for her to keep targeting mine. But entitlement isn't rational. That night, my camera caught her sneaking into my driveway again, this time armed with a bucket of paint. She sloshed neon green streaks across the charger, muttering curses under her breath. I didn't confront her. I didn't call the police. I just let her finish, recorded every second, and quietly emailed the footage to the board. The next morning, the board president called me personally. "We saw the video," he said, his voice heavy with exasperation. "We're opening a misconduct inquiry. This has gone too far." Finally, the tide had turned beyond repair. Karen wasn't just an annoyance anymore, she was a liability. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about vandalism charges, about potential fines, even about removal from the board. Karen, sensing her empire collapsing, tried one last desperate maneuver. She hosted a town hall in her front yard, complete with folding chairs and a borrowed microphone. She begged, pleaded, and ranted about injustice, painting herself as a martyr for community rights. A handful of die-hard loyalists clapped, but most attendees left shaking their heads. By the time the sun set, her crowd had thinned to nothing. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee, satisfied but not complacent. Because I knew Karen well enough to understand that humiliation wasn't the end for her. It was fuel. She'd strike again, and next time she'd aim for maximum destruction. I had to be ready. So I upgraded my system once more. I added surge protection, tamper alarms, and a hidden GPS tracker in the charger housing. If she tried anything again, I'd know instantly. The trap wasn't just reactive anymore, it was proactive. Every step she took brought her closer to triggering it. When the footage of Karen with the crowbar hit the neighborhood email list, the silence was deafening. No defenders, no sympathetic emojis, no long-winded posts about community virtue. Just silence. And silence, in a place like ours, is the sound of walls closing in. The next morning, her driveway was empty, her shiny EV gone, and her blinds stayed drawn. For the first time since this feud began, Karen had disappeared from view. Some neighbors assumed she was embarrassed. I knew better. Embarrassment wasn't an endpoint for her. It was a staging ground for her next move. By the end of the week, the board scheduled a disciplinary hearing. It wasn't optional. Karen had to attend or risk forfeiting her position. Flyers went out, ironically printed with the same clip-art lightning bolt she'd once used to brand her fake task force. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the clubhouse, and the turnout was bigger than the 4th of July barbecue. People brought folding chairs and snacks as if it were a movie night. In a way it was. Karen arrived late, of course, making a grand entrance in oversized sunglasses and a white coat that looked theatrical even by her standards. She carried a stack of folders like ammunition and launched into her speech before the board could open the session. She blamed me for orchestrating a smear campaign, accused the board of bias, and even suggested the crowbar footage was deep-faked. The room shifted uneasily, not with sympathy but with second-hand embarrassment. When my turn came, I didn't bother with a long rebuttal. I stood, projected the footage on the wall, and let the video play without commentary. Karen, illuminated in high definition, struggling with the charger, muttering curses, swinging the crowbar. Gasps rippled through the room. Then laughter, quiet at first, then louder as people realized the absurdity of it. She wasn't a visionary or a crusader. She was just a furious woman in her pajamas, vandalizing something that didn't belong to her. The board voted unanimously to censure her. Effective immediately, she was stripped of her committee roles and barred from representing the HOA in any capacity. For most people, that would have been the end. For Karen, it was a declaration of war. 2 days later, strange things began happening. My trash cans were knocked over every night, though the wind was calm. Packages left at my door vanished. Someone dumped a bag of mulch across my driveway. Small inconveniences, petty acts designed to needle me. I didn't need cameras to know who was behind it. Karen's rage was spilling out in childish ways, the last gasps of a dethroned monarch. But I wasn't interested in tit-for-tat. I had something bigger in mind. See, while Karen was busy unraveling, the community charger at the clubhouse was nearing completion. The electrician had finished the install, the ribbon cutting was scheduled, and the HOA had even invited a local news crew to cover the sustainability milestone. I saw opportunity in that. Karen would never let the spotlight shine without trying to hijack it. And if she did, I'd be waiting. Sure enough, the day of the ribbon cutting, she appeared at the clubhouse with a bullhorn. The crowd, neighbors, board members, even a city councilman, watched as she ranted about corruption, betrayal, and my supposed profiteering. She waved a folder of evidence that looked suspiciously like old HOA newsletters stapled together. Her voice cracked as she shouted over the polite applause for the official speakers. It was chaos, exactly the kind of spectacle local reporters loved. And that's when I sprang the next part of my trap. I had already shared my archive of Karen's antics with the news crew, quietly, discreetly, off camera. When she began her tirade, one of the reporters asked, "Karen, isn't it true that you've been caught vandalizing your neighbor's private charger?" The question hit her like a brick. She sputtered, denied it, called it a smear. The reporter calmly noted that they had reviewed the footage. Her face froze. The crowd shifted. People whispered, cameras clicked, and Karen's bravado cracked. She tried to storm off, but her car, parked illegally in the fire lane, was already being ticketed by an officer who had been standing in the crowd. It was the perfect storm. Humiliation layered with consequence, all in front of the very audience she'd tried to manipulate. That night, the neighborhood group chat lit up like fireworks. Memes circulated, photoshopped images of Karen with a crowbar, jokes about deepfake pajamas, even parody event invitations for community charger fair, bring your own generator. She became less a threat and more a punchline. And that, I realized, was more damaging to her than any fine or censure. You can fight anger. You can't fight ridicule. But Karen wasn't done clawing. A week later, I got a knock on my door. It was a police officer, polite but firm, holding a complaint. Karen had accused me of harassment, claiming I'd cyberstalked her with surveillance footage and incited neighbors against her. The officer had the weary look of someone who'd been dragged into neighborhood drama too many times. I invited him in, offered coffee, and showed him the full archive, time-stamped, clear, indisputable. He watched silently, then closed the folder and said, "Sir, I'm going to file this as unfounded." His eyes flicked toward Karen's house. "But I think you should prepare yourself. People like this rarely quit." He was right. That evening, Karen staged one more stunt. At twilight, she dragged a folding chair into the cul-de-sac, sat down with a hand-painted sign reading "Justice for Karen," and refused to move. Cars honked, kids laughed, someone handed her a bottle of water like she was on a hunger strike. She sat there until midnight, then retreated inside when the sprinklers came on. By morning, the sign was gone, but the story lingered in whispers of disbelief. And me? I didn't lift a finger. Because at this point, she wasn't fighting me anymore. She was fighting herself, her own reputation collapsing under the weight of her theatrics. All I had to do was stay calm, keep documenting, and let her burn out. But I wasn't naive. I knew Karen's final act was still coming. People like her don't fade quietly, they implode spectacularly. And as much as I wanted to move on, I understood that the endgame wasn't in my hands yet. It was in hers. The trap was set, the stage was built, and all I had to do was wait for her to take the last step off the edge. Because she would. And when she did, the entire neighborhood, maybe even the whole city, would be there to see it. And I'd be ready. It was the middle of the night when the trap finally closed. I woke to the shrill ping of my phone alarm, the tamper alert from the charger. For a moment I thought it would be another half-hearted attempt with a screwdriver or a sticker, the sort of nuisance Karen specialized in. But when I pulled up the camera feed, I froze. This wasn't petty sabotage. This was desperation incarnate. Karen stood in my driveway with a gasoline canister, eyes wild, hair unkempt, muttering to herself as she sloshed liquid across the charger housing. I didn't waste time. I called 911, gave them the address, and told them plainly, "My neighbor is attempting to set fire to my property." Then I kept watching, phone in one hand, heart pounding. The camera's microphone picked up every word she whispered. "If I can't have it, no one can." She struck a lighter once, twice. The flame sputtered but didn't catch. The nozzle of the gas can was capped. I'd anticipated tampering weeks ago, and replaced the cover with a lockable version. She hadn't noticed. She shook the can violently, cursed, and tried again. That was when the squad car lights painted the cul-de-sac in red and blue. The officers were on her before she could react. The can clattered to the ground, rolling harmlessly onto the grass. One officer grabbed her wrist, the other pried the lighter from her hand. She shrieked about conspiracies, about entrapment, about me orchestrating everything. From my porch, I watched in silence as the neighbors gathered, pajama-clad, rubbing their eyes, whispering in disbelief. This was no longer the Karen they knew, the loud but functioning tyrant of HOA meetings. This was someone unraveling in real time. The police cuffed her gently, almost respectfully, but the scene was beyond repair. She kicked, screamed, and demanded that the officers arrest me instead. He stole from us. He poisoned this community. Her voice cracked, raw and shrill, echoing down the quiet street. A neighbor filmed the entire spectacle. I didn't need to ask for a copy. By morning, the video was already circulating in every group chat. The fallout was swift. The board issued a public statement condemning her actions, calling them dangerous, reckless, and entirely her own. The clubhouse bulletin carried the same message. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just distancing themselves from Karen, they were disowning her. By the end of the week, she had been formally removed from the board, banned from committees, and fined heavily for vandalism and attempted arson. She tried appealing, of course, but appeals require allies, and hers had vanished. Even her die-hard sympathizers had gone quiet, unwilling to attach their names to gasoline and lighters. But the real blow came from the city. The footage and police report reached the council, and suddenly Karen wasn't just a nuisance in a cul-de-sac squabble, she was a liability. The fire department filed charges for reckless endangerment. She faced a hearing not in the cozy confines of the clubhouse but in municipal court, under fluorescent lights and a judge's unblinking stare. I attended, not out of spite but out of duty. She pointed at me across the courtroom, ranting about my surveillance, my so-called conspiracy. The judge cut her off with the bang of a gavel and reminded her this wasn't a soapbox. The verdict was clear: probation, mandatory community service, and an order to stay away from my property. The neighborhood changed after that. The clubhouse charger went live, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that, ironically, Karen had once dreamed of hosting. Families lined up to take turns, laughing, snapping photos, treating it like a festival. Kids rode their bikes in circles while parents charged their cars without worry. My own charger, scrubbed clean and fortified with new locks, stood idle most days. I didn't mind. It had served its purpose. Neighbors who once regarded me with suspicion now stopped by to chat. The retired police chief invited me for coffee. The daycare couple dropped off cookies. Even the board president, a man who had previously dodged every confrontation, thanked me for my patience and resilience. It was strange, being seen as the calm in the storm. But I hadn't been calm for their sake. I'd been calm because I knew the long game always wins. As for Karen, she faded. Not quietly, not gracefully, but inevitably. She sold her car first, claiming it was too expensive to maintain. A few months later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. Rumors spread. She was moving closer to family, she was downsizing, she was pursuing new opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. She wasn't leaving for something better. She was fleeing the wreckage she had created. When the moving truck finally pulled away, the neighborhood exhaled. I stood on my porch that day, coffee in hand, watching the taillights disappear. There was no victory cheer, no gloating. Just a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when justice doesn't need your help anymore. The trap had sprung, and Karen had walked herself into it every step of the way. Weeks later, when the chatter died down and the cul-de-sac returned to its usual rhythm of lawnmowers and kids playing tag, I walked over to the clubhouse charger. The paint was fresh, the signage professional, the station gleaming. A neighbor was unplugging his car and waved me over. "Crazy how far we've come, huh?" he said, shaking his head. "All that drama, and we could have had this from the start." I smiled, not bitterly but knowingly. Some people don't want solutions, I said. They want control. And when control slips through their fingers, they'd rather burn the whole place down than admit they lost. The neighbor chuckled. Well, lucky for us, she didn't succeed. He drove off, and I stood there a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the charger, the sound of progress untainted by ego. Back home, I opened the folder where I'd stored all the evidence. The videos, the screenshots, the bogus letters. I scrolled through them one last time, then archived the lot. Not because I wanted to forget, but because the story was over. Karen had written her own downfall, and I had simply turned the pages. That night, as I sat on the porch under the glow of my porch light, I thought about everything that had happened. About the absurdity of someone declaring another's property public. About the theater of HOA politics, the endless posturing, the fragile empires built on noise. About how entitlement always disguises itself as virtue until the mask slips. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel triumph. Just clarity. Clarity that people like Karen will always exist, but their power depends on others playing along. The moment you stop feeding their theater, the stage lights dim. The moment you hold up a mirror, they unravel. And as the night settled quiet around me, I realized something else. Karen hadn't exposed me. She had exposed herself. My trap was never about wires, locks, or cameras. It was patience. It was restraint. It was the long game. And in the end, the long game always wins.